Hi, I'm Rain Emery. I am a costumer, a cosplayer. I've been sewing for over 10 years now, and another pattern has come out that I made with Simplicity, which is Simplicity pattern 3228, which is a costume ball gown pattern. For this tutorial, we're making this dress, and the concept for it was, what if Alice stayed in Wonderland and became the next Queen of Hearts? So I wanted it to be spooky and, look worn. All seams are going to be 5/8 of an inch unless otherwise stated. And if there's a method that you'd prefer to do instead of what I tell you to do, please do it. I hope this tutorial helps you, and let's get started. Here is pattern Simplicity 3228, and if you flip it onto the back, on this flap up here, you can see the measurements that you'll need to determine the size that you or the person who will be wearing this will need. Here are the notions that you'll need and the recommended fabrics for this project, and determined by the size that you found by the measurements up here. Here are the fabric amounts that you'll need for each item, and then here is the finished garment measurements. First, I pulled out the bodice pieces, which are 1, 2, 3, and 4. The bodice front, the bodice side front, the bodice side back, and the bodice back. I've cut 2 out of each for the main fabric, the interlining fabric, and the lining fabric. And I made a design choice that this red panel will be in the front. Before we sew them all together, we are going to add a stay stitch at the top and bottom of each single piece. So add a stay stitch at the top here, and at the bottom, at the top here, and at the bottom, at the top here, and at the bottom, at the top here, and at the bottom on every single layer. So make sure to stay stitch in the directions that the instructions tell you to stay stitch in. And then after there is a stay stitch at the top and bottom of each piece, for the center front pieces, place each layer right sides together like that, and then matching up those notches along the straight edge, pin all the way down, and then sew from here all the way down and then press open. Remove the interlining and lining layers because we will be focusing on that later, and that leaves the main fabric that you will see on the outside. As you can see, I have added a stitch to the center here to combine the center fronts and pressed it open. Now take the bodice side front, and just a quick note, this fabric is knit technically, but I added interfacing onto the back of it, so it works just like a woven fabric. You will not need to add interfacing to this fabric unless you think it really needs it. Right sides together, place the side front of the bodice to the front of the bodice, and then matching up notches. You're gonna start from here and pin all the way down. You can clip the curves if you need to. Then sew from top to bottom, and then repeat on the other side with the other piece. The side front bodice pieces have been sewn onto the center front bodice pieces, and before pressing it open, take this curve right here and between these 2 notches, trim it down to about 1/4 of an inch, and so it's easier to press and it looks like this. Cut it. This eliminates the bulkiness from the curve and allows pressing to be more easier. So now go ahead and press this open. That is pressed and ready to go. So set this aside and pull out the side back and the back, and with right sides together, not on the side but on the curved edge, place the side back right sides down and match the double notches and start pinning all the way down. Then sew from the top to the bottom, clipping curves as needed, and press open, and repeat that on the other pieces. The side back and the center back have been sewn and pressed open, and along the curves I have added clips so that pressing it open makes it easier and also it lays flatter. Now bring out the center front and side fronts that we sewed together. Line up the side back to the side front like that, pin it, and then you'll sew down and mirror that on this side, and then after that sew together the shoulder seam right here, matching notches. So from here down to here, here to here, and then repeat that on the other side, and then press those open. The main fabric layer is now all sewn together, so set that aside and then pull out the interlining layer and then sew it the exact same way that we just sewed the main fabric layer. Now that we have the interlining layer all sewn together, we're going to make the boning channels. On the center front seam, the side seams, and the side back seam, stitch away from the center seam 3/8 of an inch on both seam allowances here. That'll create a little channel for the boning to go into, and do that on the side back, side seam, and the center front seam, and repeat on this side too. And then once you have those sewn, pull out 1-inch twill tape. Ribbon will work too. That is the length of the center front and side front seam. And because we clip this down just to get the curve, we will use this as the boning channels. Pin this about in the center of the seam and stitch away from the twill tape 1/8 of an inch on either side and then down the center. This will create 2 channels. Then once you've done that, pull out 2 pieces of 1/2-inch twill tape or ribbon and measure it from the dot to the dot that we drew onto the side front piece and add 3/4 of an inch, and then cut it. And then when pinning it on, fold each edge over like so, one edge there, and fold the other edge over as well like that, and then pin it and then stitch on either side really close to the edge, and that will be another channel. This is what the channels should look like now. About 1/4 of an inch of spiral steel boning, which looks like this. Yours could look a little bit different. To measure this out, take the spiral steel boning and line it up in the channel that it needs to be in. About right here is the length of it. Then subtract 1.5 inches from that, mark it, cut it, and then finish the ends however you'd like. I just use these boning caps. And for each channel, do the same thing, but for the 1/2-inch twill channel, you will not subtract 1.5 inches. You will just make it about the same length, about 1/8, 1/4 of an inch less, just so we can fit it all into the channel. All that boning is ready to go, but we're not going to insert them yet. First, we gotta insert the cups. So whatever cup size that you need for yourself or whoever's wearing this, grab that. Oh, I also cut out 2 boning pieces that are the length of the center back edge minus 1.5. And that we're not going to focus on right now for a little while, so I'll just set that in a safe place. And remember which channel each boning piece goes to, and take it off. Take 1 cup and place it in the most curved part of this seam, the side front and center front seam, like that. I like to flatten it down a little bit and start pinning, and make sure you avoid this channel right here. That looks about right. Once this is in a place that you're happy with, use a zigzag stitch and zigzag all the way around, but break at the channel points so we don't close the channel. When that's sewn, repeat those same steps on this side and make sure that they are as even as possible. You can measure if you need to. Awesome, now insert the boning. All right, now the boning is in the channels, so go ahead and stitch 3/8 of an inch from the top of the channels and the bottom of the channels, except for these diagonal ones. Just stitch right along the edge, and then they'll all be secure. Okay, now all the channels are closed. So I'm gonna flip this around. This is what it looks like on the outside. Take out the main fabric of the bodice that we set aside. Place the wrong side on the right side of the inner lining. Now pin all around the raw edges on the outside and on the armholes. Once that is all pinned, stay stitch around the raw edges of the outside 3/8 of an inch and around the armholes 1/2 of an inch. And here is what it looks like on the front and the back. So that is all secure now. Set that aside and bring out pattern number 8, which is the sleeve. With the sleeve, we have one pair cut out of the main fabric and one pair cut out of the lining. I set the lining aside for now. I'm just focusing on the main fabric. Between these two notches, add a 1/4 inch and a 1/2 inch gathering stitch so that it looks like this. And we can ease this in when we insert it into the armhole of the main fabric bodice. And then right sides together, fold it over. Oh, there's so much thread. And then pin along this line and sew down here. So when we're done with that, it looks like this, and I pressed it open too. And then we can insert into the sleeve, and using the bobbin thread, we can ease it in without any puckers. To insert the sleeve, first pull the sleeve right side out like that. Right sides to right sides. Start pinning by pinning the side seam here to the seam on the sleeve that we just made. And then I'm going to flip it out so you can see it. Match up the notches and pin those. And then match up this dot with this dot on the sleeve and pin it. Now adjust the easing all the way around and then pin it all in place. And if you need to clip the curve here of the armhole to fit it in better, go ahead and do that. And then once you have it pinned, it should look something like this. It looks like a very dangerous circle. So after that, stitch all the way around 5/8 of an inch and then go around one more time at 1/2 of an inch just to make sure that it's super secure. The sleeves have been sewn in. I clipped all around the curves and I trimmed down the bottom between the two notches so that helps it to lay flatter. Then I took it to the iron. I pressed the seam out towards the sleeve and so it looks all nice and neat. Ta-da! Here we go. Before we move on to the sleeve ruffles, I'm going to do something that's a little bit different than what the pattern instructions tell you to do. So I'm going to use this spray. It's a weathering aging spray. I'm going to do it along the bottom of this bodice and along the bottom of the sleeves. So it'll give it that weathered, worn look, which is what I'm going for. I'm going to do that and then I'll let that dry and then we will work on the sleeve ruffles. For the sleeve ruffles, I have patterns 9 and 10 here. I added some weathering to the bottom just with white acrylic paint and a overused paintbrush. I dry brushed it onto the bottom, just kind of stippling it and rubbing it in. You can also use an airbrush for a more uniform look. You can also dye it by doing an ombre dye if you'd like. You can also do it to the top instead of the bottom. And before I move on to the sewing step, I just wanted to let you know that with this fabric, it is most ideal to use a tool or something that will not fray because we will be distressing it and we will not be hemming it at the bottom. So now I have 2 of the upper sleeve ruffle and we're going to do a French seam here. So if you need more detailed instructions on how to do a French seam, please refer to number 16 on the instructions because that goes more into detail, but I will walk you through it pretty quickly. So wrong side to wrong side, match up the side seam and stitch along this edge at 1/4 of an inch. Once this is sewn, trim it to about 1/8 of an inch, press it open, flip it wrong side out, and then press this edge and then pin it down and stitch about 3/8 to 1/4 of an inch so that encases that raw edge, and then you'll be able to flip it out again and it'll look super nice and neat like this. So that is a French seam, and again, refer to number 16 on the instructions for more detailed information. These two have French seams on them now, and just make sure that they are mirrors of each other and set this aside and then do the same exact process of adding French seams onto number 10, which is the lower ruffle. So with the wrong side of the upper ruffle, now let's combine the upper ruffles with the lower ruffles. Combine it with the right side of the lower ruffle and match the side seam and the notch together and then pin. And then once that is pinned, add a basting stitch all the way around and then add 2 gathering stitches here at the top, one at 1/4 of an inch and one at 1/2 of an inch. And then repeat that on this set of ruffles and then we'll be ready to go on to the next step. With the sleeve ruffles combined with gathering stitches on top, I've already gathered it a little bit. Find the shorter length, which should be the front and the side seams as well, and then flip it so that right sides are together with the sleeve and the sleeve ruffle, and then match up the seams, pin that, and then match up the notches, pin that, and then adjust the gathering stitches so that it fits the length of the sleeve opening, and then pin all that all the way around so it looks something like this. And then take this to the sewing machine and sew all the way around. You can baste beforehand and then add a stitch all the way around. Once that seam is stitched, trim the ruffles and the seam, then press it inwards towards the sleeve so that the ruffles are out and the seam is pressed towards the sleeve. Pull out the bodice lining pieces and make them the same way that we made the main bodice fabric pieces, except there is no interlining layer. Then with the sleeve, press it under, so towards the wrong side, 5/8 of an inch, and then once it's pressed, trim that 5/8 to 3/8 of an inch. Here, I will pull it. So this is what it looks like. It has the raw edge pressed towards the wrong side, 5/8 of an inch, and then you'll trim it to 3/8 of an inch here. And you'll do that on both sleeves. Like that. And now pull out the other two layers, and with the lining layer right sides together with the main layer, place it down and match up the center backs and pin those down. And now that that is pinned down, stitch on both edges to close them up. The center backs have been sewn and I trimmed it in layers so that it reduces the bulk. And now flip it right side out. Like that. Then take it to the iron and press this seam down so that the seam lays flat like that. And then pin from the top to the bottom. And repeat on the other side. And now that you have the two center backs pinned like that, stitch from the top to the bottom 3/8 of an inch away from the edge. This will create a boning channel, which we will bring out these boning pieces again that we set aside a while ago, if you remember, and then we'll insert them into those channels. And then once those are in, stitch away from the raw edges on the top and bottom of those channels 3/8 of an inch, and that will close the channel so we can move on to the next step. Those back center seams are looking pretty good, if I do say so myself. At this point, we need to combine the lining to the other two layers like we did with the main fabric and the interlining layer. Pin all the way around the raw edges matching the seams, and then stitch away from the raw edge 3/8 of an inch so that it is all combined together. Now that it's all pinned, go ahead and sew the top and bottom raw edges together. It's looking like a real bodice, you guys! Next, we're gonna combine the lining of the sleeve to the sleeve itself. So pull the main sleeve to the wrong side and pin so the pressed edge of the lining matches where the seam of the ruffles start. And once that is pinned, slip stitch all the way around so that it is closed and attached to the inside of the sleeve. And then repeat on the other sleeve as well. Sleeves are done, so we'll flip them right side out. Oh, ta-da! There we go. And then we'll set this aside for a little bit and pull out number 5, which is the drape for the bodice. And before we proceed, just make sure that you place the grain line along this line here so that this direction stretches, especially if you are using a woven material. I'm just using tulle, so it doesn't really matter. So take the fabric and wrong sides together, fold it in half. So we are folding it on the fold line here. It says fold line right there, and match up the notches and edges and pin it. And then press this folded edge with the iron. Here, I'll flip it around so you can see it a little bit better. After that, add 2 gathering stitches, 1 1/4 and 1 1/2 of an inch, starting from here, over here, and down here on the raw edges. And then after you add those 2 gathering stitches, mark the center line. If you're using tulle, this will help to place it on top of it so you can see the line. Mark a line here and then stitch away from that line with a gathering stitch, a 1/16 of an inch away from each side, so that you have 2 gathering stitches that are 1/8 of an inch apart, and you'll be able to gather that. Oh, and also after that, I am probably going to add some weathering to this, probably in the center just to add dimension, but of course you do whatever you would like to. Bart would like to say hi. I hear that purr. The drape is ready to go, and I weathered it with acrylic paint again with that paintbrush. So I'll set that aside for a moment. Pull out the bodice again, and with your applique of choice, I'm going to use this one. I also added some weathering spray to it that I did for the bodice here. I'm going to hand stitch it to the bodice underneath the placement of the drape. So on the bodice patterns for number 1 and number 2, there are placement lines, and I trace that out onto the bodice here. I don't know if you can see, it's very faint, but the shape goes under the bust. And right at this point here, I'm going to place this applique right there, and you can overlap the line if you'd like. I'm gonna place it, I think, right about there. Pin it, making sure it's centered. All right, that looks about good. So I'm going to hand stitch around the edges and probably in the center as well. Just slip stitching it to keep it in place, and then we'll add the drape. That is stitched on now. The next step is to grab the drape and gather the center and then pin it in the center where above the bust line. Here, let me show you exactly where to place it. This is what our drape looks like right now. Place this large dot that you marked onto this large dot that you marked onto the bodice center front, and then this small dot right here that is at the very bottom of the fold onto this small dot. So first, gather it up and place the dots together at the center front top right here, and I will pin that, and at the bottom of the fold right here, about there, pin along the center front seam here and adjust the gathers as you'd like. Okay, so it should look something like this, and then hand stitch in place along this line here, so in between the gathering stitches, and make sure it is tacked down. Now next, place these large dots on the drape onto the large dot here at the end of the placement line on the side front. So that for me would be right here. I'm gonna pin that, and right here on this side. Now with the folded edge of the drape, pin it down along the placement line. It looks a little messy, but something like that. And then repeat on the other side. And now hand stitch invisibly the drape that we just pinned to the fabric. And then we'll focus on this afterwards. Nice, nice. Okay, next we're gonna work on these gathers finally. So place the small dots marked here onto the dots on the side front, which are marked, wait, where are they? Oh, right here. Oh yeah, it's right there. Okay, now adjust the gathers to fit. Then pin it, and once it's pinned, stitch away from the raw edge on where we just pinned 3/8 of an inch. Awesome, great. Now let's give the drape a little bit more shape. Usually I like to put this on a dress form and play around with it and pin it in random places. And then I will take it to the ironing board and I will add some light steaming to it so that will mold it more to the shape of the bust. So after that, you should be done with the drape. So play around with it, and once you have pinned down some places you'd like to tack down, go ahead and do that by hand stitching. Okay, we're ready to move on to the next step and set this aside for a little bit and bring out pattern number 6, which is the binding. Make sure that you cut it on the bias, so having the grain line this way where this arrow is pointing, so that it stretches, and we can create bias binding from this that will conform to the curves when we sew it on. So first, here I'll show it to you on the pattern. We have a notch here and a notch here. This may feel a little bit weird. You'll have to match up the notch to the notch. There will be overlap on this side and overlap on this side, and pin that and then sew where the 2 points overlap right here and then press it open. So find the notches from that pattern and then match them up and pin them. And then once you have that pinned, stitch 1/4 of an inch all the way down where these 2 edges overlap and then press it open. And then I'll be right back. Now that it's sewn, I can flip it around, and with those lines that I transferred from the pattern, I can now start cutting and following that line down in a spiral, so it will create continuous bias strips. Now just like magic. To make the bias binding, I'm going to use my handy dandy little bias tape maker, which is at 1/2 inch. If you don't have one of these little guys, go ahead and follow steps number 27, 28, and 29. Those have detailed instructions on how to do it without a bias tape maker. If you do have one, let me show you how to do it. With the wrong side up, or the seam up, I'm going to thread this through, pull it out, and then at the ironing board, I'm going to press down as I pull it through. And that will create this double fold, which then after that, you can fold it over to where this top fold almost meets the other fold and press that down. And then do that all the way down, and then you'll have homemade bias tape. All of this, the bias strips have turned into little bias noodles. I'm gonna show you 2 ways that you can add on the bias binding, and we're gonna add them onto the bottom raw edge and the top raw edge of the bodice. So the first way that the instructions show you how to do it is take the bias binding. I'm gonna snip off this pointed edge here so that it's a nice straight line, and then fold it in towards the wrong side, 3/8 of an inch, give or take. I don't have a measuring tape right now. And let me zoom in so you can see it better. With this folded in at 3/8 of an inch on the longer side, you're going to place that behind on the lining side, and the shorter side is going to be on the outside or the main fabric side. Pin that, and then pin that all the way down, and make sure that this crease in the center is going on the edge. And you're gonna pin it all the way down, following the curves, and then you'll stitch it down on the outside along this edge right here. And because the longer edge is on the inside, it'll catch once you stitch on the shorter side here. So that is that method. The method that I'm going to do today is I'm going to open it up. So I'm gonna leave a little bit of an overlap on the bias binding here. And then I'm gonna start pinning that bias binding's raw edge along the raw edge of the bodice top. So I will pin that all the way down. Once that is pinned on, stitch along this creased edge right here that we pressed. Not the middle, not the other side, the edge that is closest to the raw edge here. And then once that is sewn, flip it so that it meets those seam lines that we made earlier. And then pin that down, and then fold in the edge here like that, and stitch along this edge. Now with this method, you don't have to worry about catching the other side when stitching it down on this side. And that is the method that I will be using for this step. But again, use whatever method that works best for you. And then after you do the top, finish the bottom edge the same way. We've got the bias binding on, yay! The next step is adding grommets. It's one of my favorite parts. On the bodice back pattern, which is number 3, you'll see these lines of dots. So I've marked those out onto the center back here, and those are the grommet placements. A leather hole puncher, but I use it as a fabric hole puncher and it works. I'm going to punch out all these holes. Let me show you an example. Just do this one down here, starting off. Find that marking. And then I'm gonna pull out my grommet machine, and I've got a grommet and a washer here. I'm gonna put the washer right in there, put the grommet into the hole that we just made, press down, and then there's your grommet. Not too hard, right? So do that on the rest of the grommets on both center backs, and I'll see you after we've done that. All right, the grommets are in, and I just wanted to mention that I know not everybody has a grommet machine, so if you need to hammer them in or apply them with whatever method you would like, go for it. And then I'm gonna set this aside while we pull out the back panel, which is number 7. I've cut one out of the main fabric, one out of the inner lining, and one out of the lining. And I have already basted together the lining and the main fabric. So the main fabric wrong side went to the wrong side of the interlining. And I'm going to place the right side of the lining to the right side of the main fabric and interlining layer. I'm going to pin all the way around, well, almost all the way around. Now that that's pinned, go ahead and take it to the sewing machine and sew around this, but leave an opening on one of the longer sides. I'm going to leave an opening right here. You can also just sew off the edges here as well, but I'm just going to open it up right here so I can turn it right side out. And then after that is sewn, go ahead and clip the corners, pull it right side out, press it, and slip stitch this opening closed. I sewed this and left a little bit of an opening here, and I'm going to trim the corners and now flip it right side out. Using a chopstick, I'm going to poke out the corners. Give this a good pressing and slip stitch the opening closed. The back panel is good to go. Next, pull out the bodice again and flip it so the lining layer is up. And we're just going to be focusing on this side. So this is the left side. You are going to line up on this line with these 2 dots here, these 2 dots like that. And then you're going to pin in place and stitch it down. So I'm going to place it right side down and lining side up so it matches the lining. I'm going to find those placement dots about right there. I'm going to pin that down. Once that's pinned, slip stitch where you just pinned invisibly. There's the back panel, so when you close it up, whoops, that's what it'll look like, and it'll help cover your back when you're wearing this, or whoever is wearing this. Next, we're gonna add the lacing here at the back with the grommets. So I have 3/8 of an inch ribbon cut at 125 inches. You can cut more, you can cut less as you need. So I'm gonna start here from the top and start threading it through, making sure both sides are mostly equal. And then I go down. I have done this so many times, so this is just natural at this point. And then when you wear it, tie a little bow at the end to secure this. So we are not entirely done with the bodice quite yet, but for now we're gonna start working on the skirt and we'll come back to this near the end. Good job. Oh, one thing that we can do on the bodice really quick is add trim to the sleeve. So this is about 1 3/4 of an inch of trim, and I got this at the LA Fashion District. It looks distressed and I love that about this. So I'm going to overlap the seam a little bit with this trim, and I'm gonna start pinning that around like that. Good enough. Cut it right there. And then I have one side of the trim overlapped, so I can overlap it on the other side of the trim so that it doesn't fray. And then go ahead and hand stitch it on if you do choose to use the trim. Huzzah! Looks pretty good. Now we get to start working on the skirt. For the skirt, we have 4 main pieces. Number 11, which is the skirt front and back. Number 12, which is the upper skirt overlay. Number 13, which is the underskirt overlay. And then number 14, which is the waistband. We're gonna start off with number 12, which is the upper skirt. And just a quick note, the upper skirt and the underskirt are being cut out of tulle because this will be weathered and there will be no hemming on these little ripped up edges, so it'll be very similar to the sleeve ruffles. And also an important note for this tutorial, for patterns number 11, 12, and 13, for the center front of the skirt pieces, I did cut them on the fold. And how I did that was I drew 5/8 of an inch down the center front / center back seam here, and then I folded it like that, and then I cut on the fold on this line. But on the center back, I just cut it as normal. So I did that on pattern number 11, 12, and 13. I recognize that this may be a little bit confusing, so if you just want to follow the instructions in the patterns and cut the skirt fronts out with this, there will just be a seam in the middle on the front. But if you don't have enough fabric to cut it on the fold, please do just cut it with the seam here. All right, now let's get started. For the patterns 12 and 13, which are the tulle layers, I did add weathering to the bottom of them to make it a little more spooky and weathered and worn, but of course you don't have to do this. Again, I just dry brushed it with white acrylic paint and it worked out just fine. As you can see here, I did cut the center fronts on the fold, so it is a much larger piece, and the 2 backs are cut separately. So how we're gonna start off with this is we're gonna start off with a quick stay stitch line on the center back of number 12, which is the upper skirt. So we're gonna focus on the side that says center back / center front seam, and it has a notch on here, so I already have that marked. On the center back seam, you can see where I marked the notch, which was right here. And I'm going to measure down from there 1.5 inches. And then I will add a stay stitch at 5/8 of an inch for about 1 inch. And you can add more, you can add less. And then you will measure down from that same notch 2 inches. And then you will cut to, but not through, to that stay stitching line. All right, that is cut, and now repeat that onto the other center back. All right, I've got that one clipped, and I've got the other center back clipped as well, right there. So now from the points of the clip all the way down to the bottom of the center back, we're going to sew this into a French seam, just like we did with the sleeve ruffles. So wrong sides together, I'm going to pin it, and now I'm going to make this point below the clip into a French seam. If you need more of a visual reference on that, feel free to look at the sleeve ruffle section. But to summarize it really quickly, we are going to stitch 1/4 of an inch away from this raw edge and make sure that these are wrong sides together. And then we will trim it to about 1/8 of an inch, press it open, and then turn it to the inside and then stitch along the seam line with right sides together, encasing the first seam. I know that's a lot, so if you need to reference the sleeve ruffle section, it is available. There we go. The part below the clip is now in a French seam. And if you need to reinforce the bottom here, since there is no hem, go ahead and do that. For the next step, pull out the front or the fronts if you did not cut it on the fold. If you have 2 pieces of the front, if this part is cut down the middle here, go ahead and combine that seam together by sewing it into a French seam as well, the entire seam this time. Also, sewing the front piece to the back piece in a French seam on the sides. Make sure to match the notches. Forgive me because it is a little bit tricky to show all of this with tulle because there is a lot of fabric going on, but yes, turn these side seams into French seams, and then I'll be back after that. Okay, all the seams that we needed to sew on the upper skirt have been sewn. Here is one of the side seams here, and that is sewn all the way to the bottom. And I also did that on the other side as well, like that. Now set that aside while we work on number 13. This is the underskirt, which I've also cut out of tulle and have weathered at the bottom. And we're gonna do what we did on the upper skirt onto this one. And I'll see you back here once I'm done. Okay, the underskirt is now all sewn together, and here are the side seams here, and the center back has been sewn as well. Again, if you have raw edges on the center front, go ahead and sew those. Again, I cut this on the fold. Now take the upper skirt and, ooh, there's so much fabric going on here, and pin the wrong side to the right side of the underskirt. So we're just combining them. Pin together the center front, the side seams, and the back raw edges. Here there are a lot of pins, and I really hope that they don't fall out. So I'm gonna flip this to the back side so you can see better. Okay, here is the center back, and I have pinned, whoops, oh, I forgot to pin that. I pinned up the remaining raw edges on the center back seam that we have not sewn, and then I pinned all around the top of the 2 overlays, so this will combine into 1 overlay. Once you have that pinned, baste all the way around where we just pinned. Once you have that based, not on this back seam, but on the top here, add 1/4 of an inch and 1/2 of an inch gathering stitch, because we will be gathering this. Okay, the upper skirt and the underskirt have become one. They are all 1 overlay now, and set this aside because we're gonna work on the main part of the skirt. It's too big to all fit in frame, but this is pattern piece number 11, and like I did on the other 2 skirt pieces, I also cut this on the fold for the center front by measuring out 5/8 of an inch and pressing that, and then cutting on the fold here, and then cutting 2 more without the fold for the back. And I've also weathered the bottom, again with dry brushing to make it look worn and used. So here is the center front. As you can see, it is cut on the fold, but I'm gonna set that aside for a minute because we're gonna be working on the backs. I have the 2 back pieces of number 11 here, and like we did on the overlays, we're gonna find that notch on the center back here, and I will zoom on in again so you can see it better. And then I'm gonna grab a ruler or a measuring tape, and so now you're gonna measure 2.5 inches down from the notch on the pattern. Yeah, that's about right. And then from here, you're going to stitch down about 1 inch. And I've already done that here. It's a little bit hard to tell because it's the same color, but I've done that, and I've done it on the other side here too. Once you've done that, with right sides together and the raw edges even, start pinning from 3 inches down from the notch to the bottom of the skirt. So you will start stitching about halfway through that stay stitching that you just made, and you'll stitch at that point that we just mentioned all the way down to the bottom, and then you will press it open. Okay, we're starting 3 inches below that notch for the center back seam. Great, now find your way back up to that starting point and clip to, but not through, the seam allowance to that starting point. I was 3 inches beneath the notch. Press this seam open. You can also finish it in whatever way that you'd like. I like to serge. Zigzag stitching on the edges also works, or whatever method you'd like to do. Okay, once you have that done and pressed open, the next step is to have this flipped over so that the right side is up. And if you have 2 front pieces, you're going to sew them together at that center front, right sides together, matching notches, and finish the seam and then press the seam. But since I cut it on the fold, I'm going to right sides together, sew the 2 side seams together, matching notches, finishing the seam, and pressing it. So pin and sew from the top to the bottom on both side seams. And then, you know, finish the edges and then press it. You know the drill. Okay, those side seams are sewn and I have also serged it and pressed it. Next, I'm going to flip this right side out. And I'll have the center back facing you so you can tell more of what's going on. And then I'm going to bring back the overlay layer out. Remember the process that we did to combine these 2 layers together? We're going to do that, but also with this one. So that's how we're going to combine these all together. The thing that's different this time though is that the overlay is a little bit bigger than the main skirt fabric. So that's why we added the gathering stitches to be able to fit it to the main fabric. So I'm going to start matching up the center backs and the side seams and the center front, and also pin the center back right here. And then once those points are pinned, gather so that you can fit the rest of the overlay onto the main skirt. Once you have that pinned, baste everywhere that you just pinned, and then just on the top, starting where that notch is on the center back, add a 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch gathering stitch all the way around to the other end. There's also a notch near the center back on the top of the skirt. And then we will continue from there. Okay, I gathered it a little bit already and it's looking even better and it's turning more into a skirt. So that is awesome. And I'm gonna set this aside for a second and pull out number 14. This is the waistband, and I've already fused the interfacing to the other side, and I've also, on the unmarked side, pressed it up 5/8 of an inch. So on the side that does not have the dots nor the notches, I have pressed that up. Here, I'll show you the other side, like that. And then I'm going to trim it to 1/4 of an inch. Yeah, that looks like about 1/4 of an inch. Okay, pull that skirt back out and start matching the center front to the center front of the waistband. Pin that, and then match the small circles here, the small dots here, to the side seams. There's one right there, and there's another right there. And then match the notches near the center back with the notches on the waistband. There's one there, and another one there. Make sure that the center backs line up with each other, adjust the gathers to fit. And now that is all pinned, so I will stitch from this end all the way down to the other end. We got that waistband on and I trimmed down the seams a little bit in layers so it reduces the bulk. And also I took it to the ironing board and I pressed the skirt and waistband seam up towards the waistband and the waistband out so it looks nice and pressed. And the next step is to insert the zipper, which is everybody's favorite part. And just a quick note, there is still an opening right here, so don't be nervous about that right now. We will close it up eventually. All right, pull out your zipper. I have a much longer zipper than needed, but I usually get longer zippers than cut them down as needed. So I don't have an invisible zipper foot. I do have a zipper foot. So if you have an invisible zipper foot, you can follow steps 45, 46, and 47 on the pattern instructions to help guide you with that, but I'll just show you how to do it with a normal zipper foot. So with this invisible zipper, I pressed it on a very low setting with the coils not directly in contact with the iron so that it is pressed out and it is easier to stitch down. Taking your zipper, I'm going to start off with this side, which is the left side, and I'm going to take the left side of the zipper with it facing right side up, and then I'm going to turn it to the left so it's flipped around, and then with this zipper stopper, I'm going to have this zipper stopper stop about 1/8 of an inch underneath the halfway point of the waistband, so about right here. So I'm going to find that and place it so that our stitching will be about 5/8 of an inch away when we stitch it, and have that 1/8 of an inch underneath the halfway point of the waistband, like that. And then I'm going to continue all the way down until that opening. Okay, now that I have this pinned, I'm going to add a basting stitch from the top to the bottom, about in the center of the tape, and then I will go back, and then with my trusty invisible zipper foot, I'm going to stitch right up close to the coils, but not on the coils because that will just cause chaos and you don't want that. So that when we flip it over, it is an invisible zipper and it is hidden. And then stitch all the way down to that opening point that we made earlier. I am adding that basting stitch right now. And I'm now going back in closer to those coils. All right, now just check that that zips up all right, and also be careful because tulle will snag if you're not too careful. That looks pretty invisible to me. Now I'm going to mark where that seam is for the waistband and the skirt. This will help me to match it up on the other side. I'll unzip it, and we're going to flip this around and then pull out the other side, and we're going to place it in the same way that we place the other side, but now we have the marking of where the other waistband seam is, and I'm going to place that marking where the waistband seam was with the waistband seam here, and then pin it all the way down, and then we're going to stitch it the same exact way that we stitched the other side. That's all pinned and ready to go. Okay, let's see if it matches up. Oh, look, it does! Nice! Okay, I trimmed down the zipper to the length that I needed, and remember that opening that I showed you earlier? We're going to close it now. I'm going to zip up the zipper a little bit more so we have a little bit more room to work with, and I'm going to position this as best as I can so that the zipper coils don't get in the way. And then starting, ooh, my stitching wasn't very neat here, huh? So starting about 1/4 of an inch above where we stopped sewing the zipper, we're going to start there, back stitch, go all the way down and meet the start of the seam here where we were sewing the skirt earlier, just as close as you can get it. And try not to catch the overlay fabric while doing this. Great, now zip this back up, take it to the ironing board and press it down on a cool setting because we don't want to melt the tulle, that would be silly. Okay, opening up that zipper one more time, unroll the zipper coils, and then place this fold that we made earlier onto the seam line of the skirt and the waistband. And then pin it, and then stitch 1/2 of an inch from here to the end up here, and then clip the corner and then pull it right side out. So here I have it sewn at 1/2 of an inch, and then I'm going to clip the corner and then pull it right side out, like that. Okay, now that we have these two corners sewn, we're going to finish this waistband by placing that folded edge down onto the seam line all the way around and then pin it. Then slip stitch it closed invisibly, and then take it to the ironing board and press this waistband down. This is what the waistband now looks like. It is all sewn and it looks super nice on the inside. And I also added here at the top of the zipper on the inside a hook and an eye. I'll zoom in so you can see it better. I hand stitched a hook and eye on the top so I can hook that up when I am wearing it. And then the final reveal of the zipper. Ta-da! That looks really good. Now I'm gonna put this on a hanger, and then I am going to hang it up overnight so that it allows the bias of the main fabric to stretch, so that if we need to trim it so it's all even at the bottom tomorrow, we can do that. So I'm gonna hang this up and let the bias stretch overnight, and I'll see you tomorrow. Okay, I let the skirt hang overnight, and as you can probably tell, it has stretched a lot, especially this part right here. It is very uneven, so we'll need to change that. There are a few methods to help straighten this out. One is to place the original pattern back on here and cut off the excess on the bottom. Another method I like to do is to measure out the pattern first and then take out the measurement of that length and then apply it by measuring this out to that measurement, which for me is 46 inches, and then just doing that all the way around and then trimming it off when you're done. If you have another method you'd like to do, please go for it. That looks a lot better, and I think Bart agrees too because now he's chilling under it. Next, we're going to hem it. Okay, for this part, I'm zooming in again. We're going to add a rolled hem to the bottom of this. So it'll be in total 3/4 of an inch. So what I'm going to do is stitch away from this edge 3/4 of an inch, and with that stitching line, press up on it so it acts as a really nice guideline. And then after that, take this raw edge, which by the way, I serged it because it was fraying so much. So for you, it'll probably be a raw edge. Take that raw edge and fold it in to that crease that we just made on that stitching line, and then fold it again so that it's encased, and then press down and pin it. Pressing down will really help, especially because this is on a curve. So then it'll look something like this all the way around, and then go ahead and stitch along this inner folded edge all the way down, and then you'll have a finished hem. The hem is all sewn. I have 1 3/4 inch trim here, and you can choose whatever kind of trim you'd like, no matter the width, as long as you can make it work. Finding that stitching line that we just made for the hem, place that edge along that stitching line. And I like to start on one of the seams so that when we go all the way around, you're going to fold the other side like that on top of that trim. And then once you have that pinned, you will stitch along both long edges. Also, if you get to a point where you're using wide straight trim, and because there's a curve, the top has a lot more material to it, I like to add little tucks in it every so often so it continues that curve, and then afterwards you can press it down or hand stitch it. This is what the skirt is looking like so far, and if you just want to stop here, you can. But if you want more of a spooky look, like on the dress that I made for the sample for the pattern envelope, I cut out little holes on the bottom of the tulle and on the sleeve ruffles. So this is why I say use something like tulle or something that you don't have to worry about fraying when it comes to the overlays and to the sleeve ruffles. And then you will save those pieces because then we will add them as detailing to the bodice top and bodice bottom. Okay, here we go. No pressure. And I'll just cut out a piece. Make it as messy as you would like. I mean, this is supposed to be spooky and weathered. I'm gonna do a smaller one right here and stretch this out. And then keep doing that on this overlay and the other skirt overlay, and then on the sleeve ruffles. That took a minute, but that's done. And this is what it looks like all the way around. You can weather it even more, but this is what I decided to go with. And for the sleeves, this is what they look like now, so a lot more distressed looking. When I was leveling off the bottom of the skirt for the hem, I did have to cut off some weathering, so I may go in with more weathering and also weather the trim a little bit, but that is optional, of course. I cut off these pieces from the skirt overlay, so I'm gonna save those, and we're gonna add that onto the bodice. Now taking those tulle pieces that we cut off earlier, you're gonna start just pinning them on to the bodice binding on the top and the bottom, if you want that extra surface embellishment. Okay, I'm not finished pinning yet, but once you have it all pinned, stitch in the center of the bias binding seam all the way down just to tack it in place. And also, if you don't have have enough tulle pieces, you can use scrap pieces from when you first cut out the skirt. So I decided on a different design choice for the bottom of the bodice, and instead of adding the tulle pieces like I did up here, which looks pretty good by the way, I added some black trim. Next, if you prefer, you can add some airbrushing definition to the seam lines on the bodice, which I did in the dress I made on the envelope here. You can see the definition in the seam lines. I don't think that's what I'm going to go for this. I think I'm going to weather the bottom a little bit more and the trim on the sleeves, and then I'll be good to go. But if that works for you, go for it. At this point, you can be as creative as you want with the bodice. You can throw on more appliques, you can throw on more trims, more surface embellishments. But the very last step is to add a pendant or brooch or whatever decoration you like above the applique and just below the top of the bodice. Like that, and hand sew it on. And now it's finally done. Good job!